No matter who you are, it takes training. Even people that are very gifted, it takes training. And sometimes, not always, but sometimes you'll have people that don't have as much innate skill or talent, but they have the drive. And drive will take you further than talent in many ways. And I've heard from, many a professional athlete when I was younger that would come in and, and talk to people and talked about how they got started in it. And there were quite a few people that were very big names. Some of the top names that would say, hey, I'm not the, I wasn't the most talented person out there, but I was always the first one to practice and I was the last one to leave. And, I was always the one that was working on stuff on, at home and on weekends and holidays, and they just had the drive. And that's, and not everyone, I'm not saying that everyone has to do that to learn to draw. Anyone who starts to draw, the more you do it, the better you'll be. But I'm just saying that you can be whatever you can, conceive of. You could achieve that goal with your art if you work at it. You don't have to work at it 40 hours a week or 60 hours a week. Now, if you did, you'd really improve very quickly. But, if you're like, look, I enjoy drawing. I don't want it to overtake my life, but I enjoy it. Well, then, yeah, if you're drawing 3-4 hours a week, and doing that over a year and over 5 years and over 10 years, you'll be amazed at what you can do because it's a learning process. It's just like anything, so... And I'm sure that I've heard very similar things in other disciplines, whether it be learning to play the piano or learning to play the guitar or learning to, do this or that. That it's about, putting the time in, going and doing it. And hopefully it's fun, because if it's fun, you'll keep doing it. But, so it's not just about some, innate talent. It's not just some unnamed skill that you were just so lucky to possess or something like that. Some people have better eyes. Well, there's ways around that if you don't have as good eyes. Some people have better perception of depth. Well, there's ways around that if you don't have the best depth perception. If you learn about perspective and use certain types of contraptions, you can help train yourself to see and perceive depth in a much more sophisticated way. This was understood in the Renaissance. And I talk a lot about the Renaissance because we use a lot of concepts that were used in the Renaissance that I teach in the class, that I teach my students and everything like that. And we talk about this a lot because in the Renaissance they understood this. It wasn't like, oh wow, you must have been born and all this sort of stuff. And don't get me wrong, there certainly were people that were highly skilled. Not everyone was a Leonardo da Vinci. But understand that if Leonardo da Vinci hadn't trained, no one would know about Leonardo da Vinci. People want to talk about how talented Mozart was. Well, yeah, he was talented. But if he hadn't trained, he would have just been a kid with a really good ear that no one heard about after he, these hundreds of years later. The reason we know about Mozart is because he dedicated his life to training, to be a good musician. And that's why we know Mozart. Not just because he was a little, a kid with a really good ear. That helped him kind of, gave him a leg up in the industry that he chose. But it didn't decide whether, that wasn't the deciding factor. The deciding factor was all the hundreds of thousands, or hundreds and thousands of hours that he put in to learn his craft, to learn his skill. That's where as they say, rubber met the road. That's what really decided it. It wasn't just the fact that he was a talented kid who had a good ear. That's not what was the deciding factor. And so sometimes we get these ideas in our head about, and we become our own worst enemy, where we talk ourselves out of, oh, I can't do that, and you start using this negative talk, and you just gotta persevere. That's the biggest thing about learning to do anything. Be strong enough to give yourself time to learn. I've seen so many people with so much promise that got discouraged and gave up. And it's unfortunate. And I've known other people that I have been shocked because they have persevered and done things that literally have, very much surprised me because of where they started. You wouldn't think of them as the talented person. You wouldn't think of them as doing spectacular things, and yet, because they stuck around, because they put the time in, because they worked hard, they are now doing fabulous things. People are trying to buy their work. Now these aren't professional. I've had some students turn professional, but most of these people are just doing it because they like it, and yet they do it so well because they've had decent training that they can do just stuff that people are just amazed with, and people are literally tracking them down to have them do drawings of family members or beloved pets or what have you, because of the fact that they have really advanced because they put in the time. There is no better way to learn than to put the time in. That's all there is. There's been a saying, and it's been around for, it's certainly not my saying, but I remember hearing it as a boy from my grandfather and other people, where they'd say, nothing worthwhile is free. And, what was the other, there's a variation of that where, it's about the journey and all these things. And the great thing about art is it's always a journey. You never get to the point where you're like, yep, I'm done. I know everything. You could spend several lifetimes trying to learn different aspects of art and still find yourself trying to learn. It's phenomenal. And that's why art was interesting to minds as great as Leonardo da Vinci and Brunelleschi and, these wonderful, Albrecht Dürer. Sometimes people don't realize that these guys were slated for people were trying to court them in other industries. I mean, we know that people have heard about, Da Vinci's talents with mathematics, but Albrecht Dürer, he was part of the Northern Renaissance. He was a protege in mathematics as a young man. And there's a lot of mathematics to the Renaissance, the way they approached art, and it was sort of art and engineer was not that specialized. So a lot of times you had to be sort of an artist plus an engineer, and so they trained you in a lot of math. And Dürer was one of these people that understood much more so than many of his colleagues, like Da Vinci, because of the fact that he easily understood the math part. He was very adept at it, and so he was able to do things that other people certainly couldn't do. They didn't understand it, and so he was able to understand the ideas of perspective and these other things, and which was it was a new concept at the time. It was still being figured out and all these different things, and they're figuring it out through mathematics and optics and all these other things. And Dürer got it. He's like, yeah, I get that. That's mathematics and visual mathematics. And so he did things with some perspective stuff that was as good as anybody out there and better than most. It's amazing what he did. I mean, he was phenomenal, and that's why you see a lot of his etchings of these contraptions and stuff. And that was stuff that he had created, stuff that he had invented, where he was like, yeah, this demonstrates this concept that I understand that they're talking about in perspective. Here's why it works. And he would have a little illustration there showing why and how it worked and the contraption that proved it, and and he would write down the geometric proofs. Now luckily we don't have to do that, because great people like Albrecht Dürer came and they solved many of the issues with perspective hundreds of years ago. And this is the stuff that runs your 3D programs and your 3D games and all this sort of stuff, is based on concepts that have been around for hundreds of years. It's just it used to be done all with pen and pencil and quills, and now it's being done by computers much more quickly. There's this wonderful drawing by, oh goodness, what is his name? oh, it's been so long. I can't remember his name, but he did this wonderful, there's this beautiful drawing of this hugely antique, but this very ornate, antique, Romanesque sort of goblet. And it looks like it's been drawn with a computer in the wireframe of some sort of computer program, and it was all done by hand. It was all done with quill pen and ink, goose feather quill pens and all this stuff, and it was done, by candlelight, by one of these great artists, and he was really great with perspective. It really haunted him, and he was doing his best to figure it out, and it's amazing. And again, this is stuff that's just old. People think that their games are so, oh yeah, this is so new. No, it's not new. It's stuff that's been around. It's just being done in different ways and much more quickly because of the technology we have and the different, the computers and all these different things really help us to do things much more quickly than they would have been otherwise. It's amazing how they have, the first, which is now, it's an old story, an old movie or what have you, but Toy Story, when it was first done, took them something like 5 years, or was it longer? A little longer than that. But anyways, they rendered the movie, and as I understand it, that was then had to be re-rendered by hand, by digital artists who went in frame by frame to make it, even better than what was able to be done by people in that time with computers. And how did they do it? Well, they gave it over to artists where they're like, okay, this is good, but we're going to do this, and we're going to do this, and this will make it look better because of A, B, C, or D. And so they went and they got artists because artists knew how to do that. Illustrators, animators, all knew how to do it by hand. The computer was and they could do it better than what the computer could do at the time. And so that was why that movie took so long, is they used an army of artists to go ahead and take that movie and then make it much better than what it would have been otherwise, and gave it some of the magic and all that good stuff. And thank goodness they did, because what a nowadays we see, you can see 3 or 4, and you can see how much the technology has really changed and gotten better and all that good stuff, and that's wonderful. But again, there was 30 years ago, this stuff was all being done by hand. The early, movies by Disney, again, all done by hand. Peter Pan and, Dalmatians, 101 Dalmatians, and all these different, wonderful movies of the time were being drawn by, by animators and being done by hand. And so they were trained. That's why they said, well, the computer can't do it for us. What can we do now? Well, we'll get the guys in here, these artists, and these artists will do it because it's the same concepts. The computer was programmed to do the same concepts that people were doing by hand for illustration and animation and design and all this good stuff, and that's it was their expertise that helped take a movie and push it to the next level. I'm going to come in here a little bit. Again, we're starting to get where this is starting to have some depth. And hopefully we can now see that this has a relationship and starting to look a lot like this photograph. I'm going to look at this photograph here and see if we can bring in... we need a little bit more depth in the shadows and a little bit more darks in the shadows. So I'm going to go ahead, and that's what I'm doing now. I'm going to try to see if we can bring in just a little bit more of the darks into these shadows in a couple places. Not everywhere. Again, sometimes we go, ooh, that looks good, and we start, I'm going to repeat that everywhere, and that's usually a mistake. Because if it's in the right place, you're like, yeah, that works, and you start putting it everywhere, and all of a sudden now it's the same everywhere, and you lose the impact. It's kind of like if you have a night sky with a few stars on a clear night, and the Milky Way, and it's pretty spectacular. But if you also had fireflies and flashlights and searchlights and all this sort of stuff, all of a sudden the stars will get lost in all that noise. And so sometimes we can do the same thing with values. Oh, I like that value. I'll put it everywhere, and all of a sudden the everything gets lost. You lose it. There's you can talk about the law of diminishing returns if you like, and that certainly is. And that just means that with a little, like if you eat one sundae, it's good, and if you eat a second sundae, it's good, but not as good as the first. And if you keep eating it, it's going to get less and less good until it's going to make you so sick you don't want to eat any more sundaes. And if you get sick enough, you may never want to eat sundaes again. That's the law of diminishing return. That less is, and that's the whole concept of less is more. And there's all these philosophies that grow out of that. But that's the idea. The idea is that we can use just enough where it looks good, but if we start doing it everywhere, it looks less good. We start to lose instead of gaining, and so there's this balance. And again, we're back to balance. So there's these areas I'm going to leave that are not darkening everywhere. I'm going to leave some areas that are lighter. This is not going to be as dark as that. I want there to be some variation in the values, some variation through there, and the shapes, and how I'm making the shapes, and all this sort of stuff. I'm going to continue doing some of this. Taking my eyes out of focus. Now again, when you draw, always try to use a soft eye until you're like in the last, like 2%, where you're just putting the last finishing touches. Well, then bring your eyes back into focus. But if ever you're like, man, what's wrong with this? Take your eyes out of focus. You'll see the shapes better. You'll see the values better. It will help you in ways that keeping your eyes in focus won't help. And so we talk about that all the time. It's not just a way to see value, but it's a way to simplify shape. It's a way of seeing repetition and or rhythm. There we go. That's the word I was looking for. And so if you can take your eyes out of focus, it's a very powerful tool to the artist because it helps you see more. And if you actually put your eyes in focus, you actually see less because you're too distracted by the stars and the fireflies and the just all the information bombarding your eyes. And if you actually take your eyes out of focus, you can actually see more and focus in on what is important. What is it that's going to make this image work? As people like to say, how do I make it work? Well, it's usually you start asking yourself questions. Well, could the values be varied? Could the textures be varied? Could the shapes be more interesting? Am I following the rules of depth? So are things, brighter contrast in the foreground, less contrast as they go back? Did I remember to, make sure that we have, atmospheric perspective? Do I have areas of rest? If everything starts to become the same amount of texture and the same amount of detail, it starts to flatten and everything starts to become, just very distracting. Again, you want an area. So let's say we had something that's full of detail, and all of a sudden you hit this area where there's very little detail. All of a sudden that becomes like a little bit of rest. You go, that, and your eye will stay there because it needs a place where it's not being stimulated. And so people will talk about active areas versus inactive areas, or active areas versus rest areas. There's one thing about art is there's so many different ways that people will express there's not like a one vocabulary fits all. There's not a standardized vocabulary, but they are trying to say the same thing, that hey, it can't be the same everywhere. And if you have something that's very, very active, all of a sudden your area of focus is going to be the areas that are not active. If I have an area that everything is inactive, well, then the areas of activity become the places my eye will go. So again, by understanding more about stuff like that, all of a sudden you're more prepared to make things much more interesting compositionally for your viewer, because you understand how the eye is working. You understand how it is that you set our focus on something. And this is the time, I think, where we need to get in here for some small details. And that's what we're looking for. We're looking for the smaller eraser. So again, we can get in here and clear or clarify some shapes while I'm making this drawing. So again, we're trying to, these are grasses here, these grasses, and what's behind it's a little softer, a little lighter. So that's what I'm doing right now, is I'm trying to make the grasses a little darker, and what's behind it blown out, or in other words, a little lighter as we're dealing with it. Some of these darks are just a little bit too much, so I'm kind of trying to blow out some of the detail as it comes back. Because again, we are trying to get the detail softer as it goes further back. We want more of it up here. I'm going to soften some of this, I think, just a little bit more. As far as that goes. Some of this stuff between the trees, again, we start to get some. Let's go ahead and see if we can calm down some of that texture. The texture with charcoal, again, can sometimes be very distracting, so we're trying to take this and smooth it around or smear it around, get it deeper into the texture of the paper so it's not so distracting. I think we're starting to get, again, we're starting to have this area that's really starting to look like, that we have, it's looking like our picture, that we can start to see some of the trees emerging. Now, not everywhere. There's some places where it's a little fuzzy. There's some places where we're not quite so sure what we're looking at. And so we're going to come back in here. We're not done yet, but we are very close. We're close to being, to where we can see that this is, this reminds me of trees. This reminds me of mountains. And that's what we want. That's what we're looking for. That's what the whole point of our drawing is, to be able to. Again, this will pull out just a little bit more light, give us a little bit more contrast. As far as that goes, we're going to try to bring some of that in. Again, this is supposed to be the lightest of anything happening over there. I think there's a couple places where we can maybe even lighten some of the hilltop just a bit in the foreground coming up. Like so. Just a little bit, I think, is nice. It's going to look a little less flat. Leave that alone. If I start doing it everywhere, it's going to go flat again. So again, we can bring just a little bit, again, a little bit more depth in here as we're doing the drawing. Again, we're starting to get a look of, again, some of the photograph is starting to appear. We can come in here to use this to clarify some of the shapes. So again, we can use this again to clarify some of the shapes that we've got going on over here. Now this is a small drawing. If I needed more of a tip on here, I could take sandpaper and rub this on here to kind of get a nice tip. I don't have sandpaper with me. I wish I had brought gotten my sandpaper with this, but what I do have is I'm rubbing this on the tabletop first to clean it off, but also to put more of a tip on it. Because what I'm trying to erase are these small little bits just on the top of these bushes. And so I want, again, I need a smaller tip. Something about like that. Now again, we didn't come here to detail this whole thing, but hopefully we can start to see where this is starting to take on, again, some of the appearance of shrubbery and again, these distant trees. A little bit through there. There's a part where the trees get lit, and they're almost straight facing the light, so they go a little flat because they're almost front lit. So, and that's kind of through this area, through this area and through here. And so we're going to see if we can help create that look a little bit. So again, we're just trying to get some more information here. Alright, so again, we've got just enough information for this to clarify what it is that I'm looking at. I'm going to bump the contrast just a little bit. And I want sort of this to be sort of my focal point. And that just means I want to make sure that the contrast is the highest. Any bits of detail are kind of the highest. And so this is getting softer and kind of blowing out. This I'm not going to define as much. And again, these are just, I was going to use the word tricks. And that certainly, is true. These are, maybe approaches is the better, term to use. But this will give us the feeling of, again, that these are, again, trees and overlapping shrubs and all this sort of stuff. And I think we've got enough here to, well, I think I blew that out. Just that last little bit was probably the wrong little bit. So I'm going to try to catch just a little bit of the outside contour of this tree. And maybe there's, a little bit of spacing in between that tree, and then the tree comes up and then down like so. And this is a tree in front of that tree, and this is a shrub in front of that, tree, and stuff like that. And we need just enough information for this to, again, to read, to look right. I think over here, again, we're going to keep this softer. It's not as important because, again, I don't want the eye to be pulled off the edge because it's looking at some detail that doesn't matter. So again, we'll soften the detail. We'll kind of have it get a little bit darker on the edge, getting a little bit lighter as it comes in. A little darker on the edge, getting a little bit lighter as it comes in. So again, that your eye is pushed in towards the center a little bit, and they do the same thing here. You get a little bit of where we darken this just a little bit. So again, your eye comes into where there's more contrast. Okay, so it's a way to move the eye along and point the eye towards where you want it to view some of this stuff. And this is just supposed to be these grasses right through here, as far as that goes. If we wanted to, we could break up that line just a little bit more, like so. But I think we've got something here that is starting to feel like it has depth. Now, this would also be the time we might be like, okay, we're going to look over the entire drawing. And again, if this is, again, in the foreground, but we could ask ourselves, is this dark enough? And if it's not dark enough, darken it a little bit. I think it's dark enough for what we've got right here. Now would be the time to ask ourselves, well, is the sky over here a little dark? And if it was, again, the blue of that sky needed to be just a little bit lighter. And if we can see just gently, it gets a little bit lighter as the sky comes against here. It gets lighter. This edge goes darker, that edge goes lighter. And we did a little bit of that, but it looks like we could use a little bit more of it. So we could just, again, bring this, making it just a little bit lighter as it hits this edge. It's just whisper soft. We're not trying to, we're just nudging stuff right now. It's pretty close. And then as this blue moves over this way, it's getting slightly darker. There's a couple areas where it just is a little patchy. So I'm trying to, lighten some of the patches using this kneaded eraser. We have, again, this sky looks like we have white clouds, and then this darker cloud, and then we have a little bit darker through the hilltop. Again, this is getting a little softer. There's a weird little line right through there that I don't care for. So I'm going to take this, I'm going to go ahead and see if I can pull that line out of there. Maybe where'd that little, there he is. Wow, that's in there. All right. Well, now I've made it lighter, so what do I do now? Well, we're going to push it back down. So I'm going to take just a little bit of my hard pencil, charcoal pencil, and just very gently darken that down until it disappears. So again, now we've got, pretty much this, we'll just call this finished, our charcoal drawing. And again, you could play with this I could really get in here quite some time, another hour and a half, just playing with little tiny things. But I think the general impression is there, where we can start to see, oh, it's implying trees. Oh, it's implying, that there is this, this forest back here, that there's stuff that's being said by just enough to go, yeah, okay, triangular shapes, light side, dark side, oh, those look to be hills, and then our brain goes, oh, those are trees. We're implying just enough for us to understand what it is we're looking at. And when we're drawing, we want to do a lot of that, especially in something as complex as a landscape drawing. So I think we're going to just a couple, there's a little bit of line work here that goes a little flat, so try to see if I can soften just a little bit of that, a little bit of that, a little bit of that. It doesn't seem like much, but sometimes you can go, okay, that's no longer a line, it looks like an edge. And if it looks like an edge instead of a line, all of a sudden it'll have more power. Because this is not about line work, this is about edge work. It's about values, it's about basic shapes, it's about how light or dark something is based on how light or dark something is next to it. So I think that we're going to go ahead and I think we'll call this done. So for those in the class, I'm going to send you the reference, and you're going to go ahead and try your very best to try to create a value drawing of this. Again, don't get any bigger than 8 by 10 on this. We want you to really explore the values and make it, you know, as clear as we can with the values. Again, I could play with this edge line is a little bit different than what's going on there. I could play with that if I wanted to, and I certainly could. You know, we could just go ahead and start, you know, getting in there. But I think there's enough here for you to understand what we're doing. Again, if I was going to finish this, I'd play with this edge just a little bit more, play with these edges a little bit more, probably take, you know, 2, maybe 3 hours tops, and really try to get this, you know, feeling like, you know, really great, like it might be an illustration in a book. But right now we have the basics of it. We can see fairly readily how it's working, and so we want you to give it a shot. So this has been Kevin McCain with Idaho Art Classes and Kevin McCain Studios. Go ahead and, you know, for those that would like to do a drawing in your home, you've got the reference here. You can go ahead and work along with me. Again, we used just regular Strathmore 300 paper. We used vine charcoal. We used compressed charcoal. We even used some of the Conte pencil. This is a Pierre Noir 1710 France, the Conte of Paris. And it's really just Conte crayon. We used to use chunks of Conte when I was in school. These are even give you a little more control. We used, again, the stumps. We used the various erasers, small eraser, big eraser, plastic, rubber eraser, the pink pearl, the gum eraser, which is, again, just pure rubber resin, the kneaded eraser, and of course we used tissue. We used a little bit of cloth. We use these to make this drawing. So go ahead and have some fun. Get creative. Again, this has been Kevin McCain, and you guys, you know, get out there, be a little more creative, and enjoy yourselves. Bye-bye now.